Nobody in Route 9 diner knew her name. That was the first strange thing about her. She came in a little after 11 at night, when the rain had turned the parking lot into a sheet of black glass, and she picked the booth in the corner, the one with the clearest view of both the front door and the kitchen pass. She didn't look around when she did it. She just walked straight to it, like she'd mapped the place from outside before she ever touched the handle. Ray Dobbins had been running that diner for 22 years. He noticed things. He noticed the way she set her bag down, not beside her, but under the table, close to her boot. He noticed she ordered coffee, black, and didn't touch her phone once. Just sat there, spine straight, eyes moving slow across the room every few minutes like she was reading a book only she could see. She wasn't big, maybe 5'5", maybe less. Brown jacket, hair pulled back tight, hands that looked like they'd done real work. Nothing about her said dangerous. If anything, she looked tired in the way people look tired when they've been driving too long or thinking too hard. "Storm's supposed to get worse," Ray said, setting the coffee down. "I know," she said, just that. Not unfriendly, just economical, like she didn't waste words she didn't need. He almost asked her name. Something stopped him. The regulars came in slow that night, the way they always did when the weather turned mean, truckers waiting out the rain, a couple of night shift nurses from the hospital up the road, an old man named Curtis who ordered the same patty melt every single night and complained about it every single time. Nobody paid the woman in the corner much mind. That was, until the two men walked in. They came in together, shaking rain off their jackets, laughing too loud at something that hadn't been funny outside. One was big, red-faced, the kind of big that came from muscle going soft. The other was leaner, quieter, and his eyes did the same thing the woman's had, moving across the room, cataloging exits, cataloging people. Ray felt it before he understood it. Something in the air had changed pressure, like the moment before a storm breaks for real. The lean one sat at the counter. The big one didn't sit at all. He walked straight toward the back hallway, the one that led to the restrooms and the fire exit, and past that, the small office where Ray kept the day's cash before the bank run. "Hey, that's employees only," Ray called out. The man didn't stop. The woman in the corner didn't look up from her coffee, but her hand, resting flat on the table, had gone very still. Curtis, halfway through his patty melt, was the one who said it out loud. "Ray, you got somebody back there who shouldn't be." By then the big man had already tried the office door, found it locked, and put his shoulder into it once, twice, the frame groaning under the weight. Ray came around the counter fast, forgetting for a second that he was 61 years old with a bad hip and no plan beyond stop this. The lean one at the counter turned, and there was a gun in his jacket that hadn't been there a second before, or maybe it had always been there and Ray just hadn't let himself see it. "Sit down," the lean man said, quiet. That was the worst part, how quiet he said it. Everybody just sits down and this doesn't have to be a thing. The nurses froze. Curtis froze with a bite of sandwich still in his cheek. Ray stood there with his hands half raised, his heart going so hard he could feel it in his teeth. And the woman in the corner stood up. She didn't rush it. She didn't shout. She stepped out of the booth the way someone steps out of a car they've parked 1,000 times before, unhurried, certain, and she said, to no one in particular, "You should have picked a different diner." The lean man laughed, a short, ugly sound, and started to swing the gun toward her. He never got there. What happened next took maybe 4 seconds. Ray would tell people later it felt longer, that his memory had stretched it out like taffy, but the truth was it was fast, faster than anything he'd seen outside of a movie, except movies didn't smell like ozone and adrenaline and spilled coffee. She closed the distance before the barrel had even leveled. One hand caught his wrist and turned it, not hard, not showy, just correct, the way a key turns a lock, and the gun clattered onto the linoleum and skidded under a stool. Her other hand found his throat, not choking, just pinning, and his knees found the floor like they'd been waiting for the invitation. In the back hallway, the big man had finally splintered the office door open. He turned around already grinning, already reaching for whatever he thought was waiting inside, and instead found himself looking at a diner gone completely silent, his partner face down on the tile with a woman's knee between his shoulder blades, and every single customer staring at him like he'd walked into the wrong story. He hesitated half a second too long. That was all she needed. The big man's hesitation cost him everything. She was already moving before he decided anything, crossing the space between the hallway and the counter like the floor owed her speed. He swung, a wild, telegraphed thing, all shoulder and no aim, and she stepped inside it instead of away, the way boxers do when they've been hit enough times to know that distance is the enemy, not the fist. Her elbow found his ribs, something in his breath changed shape. He grabbed for her jacket, got a fistful, and for 1 second Ray thought maybe size would win out after all, the way it usually did in diner parking lots and bar fights, and every other ordinary violence Ray had witnessed in 22 years of running this place. But she twisted out of the jacket like it was a coat she was shrugging off on a warm day, and the big man stumbled forward into nothing, off balance, arms full of empty denim. She put him on the ground next to his partner. Neither of them got back up. The silence after was its own kind of loud. Curtis still had that bite of patty melt in his cheek. One of the nurses had her hand pressed flat against her own chest, like she was checking her heart was still doing its job. Ray realized he'd been holding his breath and let it out in a long, shaking rush. The woman crouched down, checked the big man's pulse with 2 fingers against his neck businesslike, the way a person checks the mail. Satisfied, she stood, walked to the counter, picked up her coffee, and took a sip like the last 4 seconds hadn't happened at all. "Somebody should call the police," she said. Ray realized that somebody was him. His hands were shaking so hard it took 3 tries to get his phone unlocked. They came fast, small town, slow night, nowhere else to be. 2 cruisers, lights painting the wet parking lot red and blue, then a third car that pulled in slower, more careful. And a woman in a windbreaker got out, who didn't look like local PD at all. She walked straight up to the corner booth, didn't ask where the suspects were, didn't ask if anyone was hurt. She looked at the woman with the coffee and said, "You could have called it in first." "Didn't have time," the woman said, "and you were 40 minutes out." The windbreaker woman sighed like this was a conversation they'd had before, in other diners, in other rain. Command's going to want a debrief. Command can want things. Ray stood there listening to 2 women talk like the last few minutes were paperwork instead of a small war fought in his diner, and something clicked into place slow and heavy, the way ice breaks on a lake in spring. "Wait," he said, Are you some kind of?" The woman in the corner looked at him for the first time like she was really seeing him, not just cataloging him as part of the room. Something almost gentle moved through her face. "I was Navy," she said, "a while back." That was all. 2 words doing the work of a whole biography. Ray didn't ask what kind of Navy made a person disarm 2 armed robbers in 4 seconds flat with her bare hands, because some part of him already knew, and some part of him understood she wasn't going to say the word out loud in a diner full of strangers, not even now. The 2 men were cuffed, hauled up, walked out into the rain still dazed, still trying to piece together what had happened to them. One of the local cops, young, hadn't shaved right that morning, kept glancing back at the woman in the corner booth like he couldn't quite believe what he'd walked in on. "Ma'am," he said eventually, notebook out, pen hovering, "can I get your name for the report?" She hesitated, just a beat, long enough that Ray noticed it, the way you notice a held breath. "Sarah," she said, "Sarah Whitfield." It might have been true. It might not have. Ray never found out for certain, and somehow that felt right, like some people pass through your life exactly as much as they meant to and not 1 inch more. The windbreaker woman, her name turned out to be Agent Ray's, FBI, tracking the same two men across 3 states for a string of armed robberies, took her statements separately, off to the side, voices too low for anyone to catch. Whatever they said to each other, it ended with Ray's shaking her head and almost smiling. "You're supposed to be retired," Ray said, loud enough this time for Ray to catch it. "I was having coffee," Sarah said. "That's all this was." By 1 in the morning, the diner had mostly emptied. Curtis had finally finished his patty melt, telling anyone who'd listened that he'd known something was off about that big fella, though nobody quite believed he'd known anything at all. The nurses left for their shift shaken but laughing a little now. The particular laughter that comes after fear has nowhere left to go. Ray walked over to the corner booth one more time before closing. Sarah was putting cash on the table for a coffee that hadn't even amounted to $2. "That's on the house," Ray said. "Believe me, for tonight." She almost smiled. It didn't quite reach all the way. "You don't have to make a thing of it," she said. "I think I might anyway." She stood, shouldered her bag, the same bag she'd kept close to her boot the whole night, and Ray wondered now what had been inside it, wondered and decided he didn't need to know, and walked toward the door. Before she stepped out into the rain, she turned back once. "Lock your office door better," she said. "That lock's been bad a long time." Then she was gone, out into the wet dark, and Ray stood there in his own diner listening to the rain fill the silence she left behind, thinking that some people walk into your life for 4 seconds and rearrange the whole shape of what you thought was possible. The story didn't stay inside that diner. Stories like that never do. By the next afternoon, half the county had heard some version of it, the version that grew a little wilder with every telling, the way stories do when they pass through enough mouths. By evening, Curtis was telling it at the barbershop with details that hadn't actually happened, the gun becoming 2 guns, the 4 seconds stretching into what he swore was a full minute, easy. Ray didn't correct him. Some part of him understood that the exaggeration wasn't really about the facts anymore. It was about a small town, needing to believe something extraordinary had happened, where nothing extraordinary ever did. What Ray didn't tell anyone because he wasn't sure how to say it without sounding foolish was the way he kept thinking about the 4 seconds themselves, not the violence of them, the quiet of them. She hadn't made a sound. 2 grown men twice her size, and she'd put them both on the ground without raising her voice once. He'd run that diner through 2 recessions, a flood, and one memorable night when a bear wandered in through a propped-open back door. He thought he'd seen most of what a small-town parking lot off Route 9 had to offer. He was wrong, and something about being wrong at 61 years old sat strange in his chest, not unpleasant, almost like hope. Agent Reyes came back 3 days later. Alone this time, no lights, just an unmarked sedan that pulled into the same lot at the same kind of quiet hour, like she'd chosen it on purpose. She sat at the counter, ordered coffee, and didn't say anything for a while. Ray recognized the look on her, the look of someone deciding how much of the truth a stranger deserved. "She really did retire," Ray said eventually, like she was picking up a conversation from days ago instead of starting a new one. 2 years back, wasn't supposed to be anywhere near this. "Then why was she here?" Ray asked. Ray's turned her cup a quarter turn on the counter, an old habit of somebody who thought better with her hands busy. "She wasn't. Not on purpose. Storm rerouted her same as everyone else that night. She just happened to be the kind of person who notices 2 men casing an office before they know they're casing it." Ray thought about the way Sarah had picked that corner booth without looking around first, like she already knew. "She have a family?" he asked, not sure why it mattered to him, only that it did. Ray's was quiet a beat too long. "That's not really something I can talk about." Ray understood, the way you understand a door that's been gently but firmly shut. Some questions weren't his to ask. He let it go. What Ray's did tell him, because maybe she thought he'd earned it, or maybe because she needed to tell somebody and Ray happened to be there with a coffee pot and a willingness to listen, was smaller than Ray expected, and heavier for it. Sarah Whitfield wasn't her name. Ray's didn't offer the real one. What she offered instead was a shape, the outline of a person without the details filled in, 14 years in. Most of it spent in places that didn't officially exist on any deployment record anyone would show you. A team that shrank over the years the way teams like that always shrink, one name at a time, until the ones still standing carried the ones who weren't in a place words couldn't reach. She doesn't talk about it, Ray said. Not even to people who'd understand, especially not to people who'd understand. Ray thought about the stillness in her, the way she'd sat that whole night reading the room like a book only she could see, and he understood something he hadn't quite let himself understand before, that the quiet wasn't just training. It was something she'd built on purpose, a wall put up not to keep people out but to keep something else in. She coming back through here? Ray asked. Ever? Ray's almost smiled, the way people smile at questions they wish they had better answers to. No idea. That's sort of the whole deal with people like her. They show up when the world needs 4 seconds it doesn't know it needs. Then they go back to being nobody. Ray thought about that for a long time after Ray's left. He thought about it while he flipped eggs the next morning, and while he fixed that bad office lock himself with a screwdriver and more stubbornness than skill, and while Curtis told the story again to a trucker who hadn't heard it yet, the details a little wilder each time. He thought about how a person could carry that much, 14 years of things that didn't exist on paper, teammates whose names lived somewhere private and unspoken, and still walk into a diner and just want a cup of black coffee and 45 minutes where nobody needed anything from her. And how the world had needed something from her anyway. How it always seemed to find people like that, no matter how far they'd walked from it, no matter how quiet they'd tried to become. He kept her $10, the exact price of the coffee she'd tried to pay for, refused and pocketed instead, folded in the drawer under the register, not spent. Not for any reason he could explain except that some nights deserved a keepsake. A reminder that the diner had, for 4 seconds on a rainy Tuesday, held something bigger than itself, and let it go again without asking its name. 3 weeks passed before anything else happened, and by then the story had mostly settled into the diner's folklore, the way big things always eventually shrink down into something people mention, in passing instead of something they talk about with their whole chest. Then the girl came in. She was maybe 16, hood up against a rain that had started thin and was threatening to get serious, and she stood in the doorway for a long moment before she actually stepped inside, the way people do when they've talked themselves into something on the walkover and aren't sure the courage will survive contact with the room. Ray recognized the look because he'd seen it before, just once, on a different face in a different corner of the same diner. She didn't order anything at first, just asked, quiet, almost apologetic about taking up his time, "Is it true what happened here, with the Navy lady?" Ray set down the rag he'd been wiping the counter with. "Something happened here, yeah. Not sure how much of what you heard is true anymore. Stories grow legs around here." The girl nodded like that answer disappointed her, then didn't. She sat down at the counter, not the corner booth, Ray noticed, like some part of her understood that seat wasn't hers to take, and ordered a hot chocolate she barely touched. "I want to do that," she said eventually, staring into the cup like the words were easier to say to it than to Ray. "Be like that, not the fighting part, the not being scared part." Ray had run a diner for 22 years. He'd heard a lot of things said across that counter, confessions, proposals, breakups, one memorable marriage proposal that got turned down on the spot. He didn't have a script ready for this one. "You scared of something particular?" he asked, careful, "the way you handle something you don't want to drop." The girl's jaw worked for a second. "There's a guy, at school. He doesn't hit me or anything, it's not that." She stopped, started again. "It's just I used to think being tough meant being loud, and she wasn't loud at all. She was just done, like she'd already decided nothing was going to move her and so nothing did. Ray thought about that a long moment, wiping a counter that didn't need wiping anymore, buying himself time to find the right words instead of just any words. I think, he said slowly, the not being scared part isn't really a part you get handed. I think it's built, slow, over a long time, out of a lot of small choices nobody's watching you make. The girl looked up at him for the first time since she'd sat down. That's not very inspiring. Ray almost laughed. No, but it's true, and true's usually worth more than inspiring in my experience. She came back 4 more times over the following month. Never on purpose, or at least she never said it was on purpose. Always just passing. Always, Mom needed something from the store. The kind of small lies teenagers tell adults and adults let them keep because pushing on them does more harm than good. Ray started saving her the corner booth on the nights she came in. Not the exact one from that rainy Tuesday, but close enough. And he never said why, and she never asked. She started talking more in pieces about the boy at school who wasn't really the problem so much as a symptom of a bigger problem. About a home that wasn't quite as safe as home was supposed to be. About a mother stretched thin in ways that used up all her attention before it could reach her daughter. Ray didn't have solutions. He had coffee and a counter, and 22 years of knowing how to let a person talk until the truth in them found its own way out into the air where it could finally breathe. "You ever gonna tell me your name?" he asked her, 3 visits in, gentle about it. "Maddie," she said, just that. Like it cost her something to hand it over, and like handing it over meant something too. It was Ray's, of all people, who brought word back one more time, driving through on unrelated business. She said, though Ray had his doubts about how unrelated anything involving her ever really was. She asked about the diner, Ray said, sliding onto her usual stool. Didn't ask about you specifically. Asked if it was still standing, if the coffee was still bad. "Coffee's not bad," Ray said, mock offended, pouring her a cup to prove it. Ray's almost smiled again, that same reluctant smile Ray was starting to recognize as her only kind. She doesn't ask about places, usually. Doesn't let herself get attached. Something about this one stuck, I guess. Ray thought about Maddie, sitting in that corner booth 3 nights ago. Telling him in a small, flat voice about a fight she hadn't started and hadn't wanted, and how she'd walked away from it instead of into it, and how walking away hadn't felt like losing for the first time in her life. "Tell her," Ray said, "if you ever talk to her again, tell her the diner's still standing. Tell her it's doing a little more good than it used to." Ray's raised an eyebrow, waiting for more. Ray didn't give her more. Some things belonged to the people who'd earned them, and Ray's, for all her badges and quiet authority, hadn't earned the shape of what had grown out of that one rainy Tuesday. Ray had. Maddie had. The woman who called herself Sarah Whitfield, wherever she was now, whatever her real name was, had planted something in this diner without meaning to and without staying to watch it grow, and Ray had decided somewhere in the last month that it was his job now to keep it alive. He kept her $10 in the drawer. He kept the corner booth a little more open than the rest. He kept an ear out some nights for a hood pulled up against the rain and a small voice asking if the stories were true. That was enough. That was, Ray was starting to understand, exactly the size of thing one diner was supposed to hold. Winter came early that year, the way it sometimes does in that part of the country, catching everyone half-prepared, coats not thick enough. The first frost showing up on car windshields 2 weeks before anyone expected it. Route 9 Diner kept its lights on late into those cold nights, the way it always had, the way Ray figured it always would as long as his hip held out, and the bank didn't decide the building was worth more empty than full. Maddie stopped coming as often once the weather turned. Ray worried about that for a while, the particular worry of a man who'd started caring about someone else's kid without ever meaning to sign up for the job. Then, one Tuesday in December, she came back in with a boy Ray had never seen before, Not the one from school. A different one, quieter. The kind of quiet that came from being careful instead of being scared. "This is Tommy," she said, sliding into the corner booth like she owned a piece of it now, which, in the way that mattered, she did. "He's picking me up from practice now. Wrestling," she added like Ray had asked, though he hadn't. "I joined the team." Ray felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't fully realized was tight. "Yeah," he said, keeping it light, keeping it easy, because he understood by now that the biggest moments in that diner were the ones nobody made a big deal out of. "You any good?" "I'm getting there," Maddie said. And there was something in the way she said it, steady, unbothered by the honesty of getting there instead of already good, that reminded Ray so precisely of a rainy Tuesday 8 months back that his throat went tight for a second before he covered it by refilling a coffee cup that didn't need refilling. The two men from that night went a trial in the spring. Ray got a subpoena, gave his statement, told the truth as plainly as he could, which turned out to be plenty. A jury didn't need embellishment when the truth already had 4 seconds of footage from the diner's ancient security camera, grainy and low angle, but clear enough to show exactly what had happened and exactly who had made it stop happening. Nobody in that courtroom ever learned the woman's real name. She didn't testify, her statement had been taken separately, sealed under circumstances Ray's wouldn't explain and Ray had stopped asking about. The two men went away for a long time regardless. Some situations didn't need every thread pulled to reach the right ending. Ray thought sometimes about the $10 still folded in that drawer under the register. He thought about taking it out, framing it, hanging it on the wall next to the calendar and the faded photo of the diner from 1994. He never did. Some things were better kept close and quiet than put on display, and he suspected she'd have agreed with that. Wherever she was, whatever name she was using now, whatever coffee counter in whatever town was currently benefiting from her particular brand of stillness. It was almost a year to the day, another rainy night, because Ray had started to notice the rain seemed to bring things to that diner that clear skis never did. When a woman walked in he almost didn't recognize at first, because she was smiling, actually smiling, in a way he hadn't seen on her even once during that first encounter. She sat in the corner booth, ordered coffee black. "Still bad?" she asked, when Ray set it down, and it took him a second to place the echo of Ray's old joke before he understood she'd heard about it somehow. Some thread connecting the people who'd passed through this place over the last year in ways Ray would probably never fully untangle. "Getting better," Ray said, matching her almost smile with one of his own. She didn't stay long. 20 minutes maybe. Asked about the diner, asked carefully, like she wasn't sure she had the right to ask, about a girl who used to sit in this booth on nights she couldn't go home yet. She joined the wrestling team, Ray told her. Doing good, real good. Something moved across the woman's face that Ray didn't have a word for exactly. Not quite pride. Something quieter than pride and heavier and better. Before she left, she set a $10 bill on the counter, same as before, and Ray understood without being told that it wasn't payment for the coffee. It was a marker, a thread tied to a place she'd never meant to matter to her and somehow did anyway. "Lock still holding up?" she asked at the door, nodding toward the office. "Best lock in 3 counties, Ray said. "Somebody told me to fix it." She almost laughed, the first real laugh Ray had ever heard out of her, and stepped out into the rain. And this time Ray didn't feel the same ache he'd felt the first time she'd walked out into a wet parking lot and disappeared. This time it felt less like an ending and more like a woman simply checking in on something she'd planted once, making sure it was still growing, before she went back to being nobody, somewhere else, for someone else who needed 4 seconds they didn't know they needed yet. Some people don't stay in your life long enough to leave fingerprints anywhere you can see them. They leave them anyway, in a locked door that finally holds, in a girl who learned to walk away instead of into a fight, in a folded $10 bill in a drawer that Ray still hasn't spent, and probably never will.